Azure Dreams for the PS1 is a game I can't believe ever even got released. In today's extremely risk-averse market, it's hard to believe any company would put out anything so niche. The game is a hardcore traditional roguelike for the most part. They came out in 1997. Granted, Rogue itself came out 17 years earlier, but the roguelike would not become a particularly well-known genre of game outside of PC grognard circles for another decade or two. It's hard to believe that anybody would put out something that would be so seemingly repellent to mass market audiences at the time. The core conceit of this game is not that dissimilar to other roguelikes, at least the ones that actually bother with developing any kind of plot or backstory at all, something that's still pretty rare today. You, the protagonist, live in a city where there's this giant tower full of monsters right there in the city. And that giant tower manages to lure treasure hunters from all around the world to plumb its heights for gold and, most importantly, valuable monster eggs that can be turned into tame monster companions. We'll come back to that. The protagonist's father vanished in the tower one day, and the game opens on the day that the protagonist can first enter the tower at age 15. As you progress up the tower, the challenge gets harder and harder, but you get better rewards, just like any roguelike. Azure Dreams is not just entirely a traditional roguelike, though, and includes what feel like some incredibly modern, persistent progression mechanics. Instead of fighting in the dungeons yourself, you'll mostly be using those aforementioned monsters that you hatch from eggs. These monsters can then be fused with other monsters to change their abilities and the type of the higher level monster. It's almost a sort of gacha game feeding type system more than anything else. This adds a very sort of Pokemon or other monster catching game type meta layer where it's not just about increasing your skill or your ability to progress as a character, it's about making sure that your monsters are going to be up to snuff for the area of the tower that you need to progress through next. The combat itself is an interesting mix of the sort of top-down mazes you'd expect in a traditional roguelike and the isometric view of a SRPG, like Tactics Ogre or Final Fantasy Tactics. Indeed, much like those games, positioning is incredibly important, and how you line up the monsters you take with you will matter a lot with regards to how quickly and efficiently you can dispatch your enemies. Your human character also has weapons and items of their own, and your goal pretty much every time you enter the dungeon is to try and figure out when you're close to death and use an item to leave the dungeon when you are. If you actually die, you lose all your items, while if you use an item to escape the dungeon, basically an escape rope from Final Fantasy, you get to keep all your items, and you can sell them at stores in the town between runs, or you can take the eggs you've collected and hatch them in the basement of your house. In my case, I would eventually always take one escape item at least with me into the dungeon so that at any point, if I started to have really low health, I could simply leave. However, this also has consequences, since you have pretty limited inventory space. Taking an escape item with you means you have one less slot that you could use for other things. If you wanted to play it risky, you could always just hope you're going to run into an escape item laying on the ground that you can use once your inventory is filled up with stuff you want to keep. And it's these trade-offs and gambles that keep the core dungeon crawling combat loop of Azure Dreams interesting through its pretty extensive runtime. The problem is that Azure Dreams doesn't use its out-of-dungeon progression to evolve your abilities or make the game easier over time to reduce the boring grind like more modern examples of the genre would. Instead, it uses this progression to make the dungeon itself an absolute grind fest. If I'm playing Rogue, I could feasibly boot it up once and beat it. Now, I likely wouldn't, because my knowledge of the game's mechanics aren't in a place that would make that particularly likely, but the fact that I could is impressive in and of itself. Even more modern roguelites, like Hades, with extensive out-of-dungeon progression mechanics, make it feasible for you to beat the game very early on if you know what you're doing, even without all the collectibles and extra abilities that you eventually get through playing the game. And that's simply not possible here. You need to spend a ton of time leveling up your monsters, using the fusion system to swap out their abilities, hatch new monsters, which, by the way, is basically a roll of the dice to get monsters that are better what you already have. Ultimately, you don't get the benefits of modern roguelites, but you also don't really get to appreciate the simplicity of more traditional roguelikes either. The dungeon does get easier the more you level up your monsters, but it also takes an absolute age to do that. And the times you're running the dungeon while doing that tend to suck the fun out of the proceedings entirely. Now, that's not to say that the game's grindiness makes it awful or unbearable or just a bad game. If anything, it's par for the course for games of the day. But it is something to keep in mind, especially if you've grown accustomed to the luxuries that modern roguelites tend to offer. Now, there's another way that you can progress outside the levels of the tower, and it has nothing to do with getting better within it. The game's relationship and city building portions, both of which are pretty heavily intertwined. As you go through the dungeon and accumulate large amounts of money, you'll be able to construct more and more buildings throughout the city that you live in, as well as upgrading your own home. Some of these upgrades and buildings are purely cosmetic, but a lot of them will unlock new relationships to build, or allow you to progress further in the relationships you're already building. They will also, in some cases, unlock new vendors or features that can make progressing through the tower somewhat easier. Now, when it comes to relationship building, the game probably feels at its most modern. It's a very sort of modern RPG way of ranking up relationships by talking to characters and completing quests for them to fetch items. That sort of really rote, complete X number of quests and I'll like you type thing. Now, generally speaking, characters will require new buildings to be built, certain items to be grabbed from the tower, or just for you to happen to encounter them within the tower and talk to them some more. The problem with having something that feels this modern in the game also makes me want to hold it to more modern standards, and when I do that, it completely falls apart. The game presents you with dialogue choices, but they only vaguely matter a few times in the entire game. Most importantly, though, the English translation is just absolutely atrocious on a level that most translations weren't at this point in time. This is SNES or JRPG levels of terrible translation, and it really makes it hard to feel invested in the stories that the game is trying to tell. Thankfully, those relationships aren't really consequential to the game's core loop and can be mostly ignored if you'd like, though the times when the game does force them upon you can be really grating. On the other hand, the poor Japanese to English translation definitely hurts the game overall, and meant that my first impression of the game was that it was a cheap budget title that had been really quickly rushed to market in the West. I mean, as I played it, it became very clear this wasn't the case, but I am still quite envious of those who played the game in its original untranslated form, or those who still could. The Japanese version is mostly the same, but didn't go through the mangled translation process the English version did. Even better yet, in something that was still somewhat rare for games at the time, especially Japanese ones, had full voice acting for all characters. Still, despite the localization issues, as I got deeper into the game, the roguelite leveling loop kept me engaged for a very long time, and it kept me wanting to come back to it. The combat works pretty well, and while it certainly becomes repetitive, and you sometimes feel like you're just grinding for the sake of grinding in order to level your monsters or farm eggs without making any real progress in the tower, Azure Dreams is a perfect entry in a grouping of sort of mindless games, a sort of thing today you might call podcast games. Games you can play while semi-distracted, whether that's listening to a podcast or having a movie, TV show, or YouTube video playing in the background. These games only require a modicum of attention and keep you just engaged enough to make what you're doing feel worthwhile. So, I think if you approach Azure Dreams knowing exactly what you're going to get out of it, you're good. You know, it's a monster-raising roguelike game with some really poor translation and an engaging combat system with some really unfortunate required grinding. So if you know you're getting that coming in, I think this game is really worth taking a look at, especially if you're already a fan of roguelikes, roguelites, or dungeon crawlers.